good afternoon, I guess.
Yeah, good afternoon for me. I guess it's morning for you guys, eh?
Yeah, it's not that early though. We're good.
You've at least had a coffee or something along those lines.
Yeah, exactly.
I know, excellent stuff.
Where are you right now?
How old do you know South Africa?
I'm decently well.
So just on the boundaries of the Kruger National Park is a little town called Hoedspruit. So I'm pretty
Okay.
much that's where I'm based.
Okay, nice. Excellent.
Yeah, it's a great place to be, that's for sure.
Can you just explain what it is you do, like as a conservation vet?
Yeah, so I mean, it's as a wildlife veterinarian, you can sort of get involved in a number of facets in South Africa. So there's sort of a split between, South Africa can actually own game. So there's quite a drive to actually own game because there's a financial value to it. So you can, as a wildlife veterinarian, you can be involved in the commercial side of things, where it's a lot of smaller systems, privately owned game farms and properties that are either breeding rare species, in an open system. And then there's the conservation aspect, which are your more open system, less management input, wilder reserves, as we could say. So sort of the photographic tourism side of things, with maybe possibly a little bit of hunting, etc., and things like that. Whereas a lot of the other private game farms and that, they're breeding species or things like that, often for the hunting market and the greater sort of tourism market as well. So as a wildlife veterinarian working on the conservation side, we're generally involved in the reserves, which are less managed and more open systems. But it can be very much a mix of where you're working. If you're working in South Africa, where we're quite fortunate to mainly be involved on the conservation side of things, with very minimal sort of commercial entities and enterprises that we assist. Whereas in other parts, you can sort of just be doing the management side of things, and it's a lot more intensive per se.
If these animals are wild and they're living in Kruger National Park and they're able to just roam these vast landscapes still, what's the need of a conservation vet?
So it's sort of multifaceted. Obviously, as I mentioned, there's the places that are sort of high input versus low input. So you want to interfere as little as possible, especially in an open system like the Kruger National Park. A lot of people are driven to try and treat animals as soon as there's an injury or a wound or whatever it may be. But it's really important to sort of let nature take its course. If it's a natural injury, just don't interfere. As brutal as it can sometimes be, we try as much to be hands off as possible. So the only times we'll really get involved is if it's what we'd call anthropogenic causes, so a human caused issue. So things like wire snares that have been set up for bushmeat poaching, if you end up with a non-target species, something like an elephant, a rhino, a lion, wild dog, anything like that ends up going through the snare, usually it's around the neck and it'll end up killing them somewhere down the line. So gunshots with, rhinos that have attempted poaching, in attempted poaching attempts, you end up with gunshot injuries in rhinos. And unfortunately, there's even cases of things being hit by cars. There's mass poisonings. We've dealt with mass vulture poisoning for poaching lion bones and body parts in particular. So those are the sort of things we'd intervene with, and that's sort of if you could say, the emergency side of things, or the unplanned interventions. The planned interventions would be things like research projects. So in these open systems, there's obviously a lot of research that needs to be done. So we get involved with immobilizing animals for collaring, so placing satellite tracking devices on them for research projects. And that's generally the most common non-emergency related reason that we'd immobilize wildlife for. And even beyond that, sometimes you'll immobilize them for disease sampling. So if you've got an outbreak of a disease, or you're worried about a disease in an open system, then you would sort of immobilize a whole lot for disease sampling, just to try and figure out what's going on. You can also vaccinate. They have vaccinated in some open systems for things like anthrax, because it's quite an easy vaccination. You can actually do it from a helicopter. Immunocontraception. So in certain systems, they're contracepting things like elephants, where there's a massive population explosion and you're trying to control the population. So it's sort of in those sort of aspects that we get involved. And then the last one is sort of the translocation of wildlife. So just taking from areas where there's an abundance, to an area and reintroduce, either as a reintroduction into an area where it historically existed, or into an area where there's such low numbers that they can actually take more. So you're just moving them either to a new reserve, which is trying to establish itself and is looking for these sort of species to pretty much draw tourism in and just increase its whole biodiversity in general.
What happens if it's an endangered or a threatened species, though, and it's not a non-anthropogenic cause to injury? Do you still have to intervene, or?
So that's where it becomes very tricky. It's a good question, because we've had that argument before where, let's say, the perfect scenario is something like white rhino that are fighting. The bulls tend to fight. That's how they do. And very often one comes off second best with horrific injuries and that. And in a natural system, what would happen is it would pass away, unfortunately. It's a weaker, older bull. That's how nature is. He's lost his territory to a younger animal, and that's how the natural selection goes. So very often it becomes tricky when you get something like a white rhino that's very badly injured. The people are driving through the reserve, they come across it, and they're like, goodness, it's a rhino. We know what situations we're dealing with rhino at the moment. We have to treat it. And it's like, well, you got to balance out there, what is the benefit at the end of the day of treating an animal like that? It's prolonging potentially its life and just making things worse for it, because it's still going to end up getting into a tussle somewhere down the line. Or worst case scenario, you actually give it a little bit of a benefit and a boost, and it breaks that little natural cycle there where it manages to maybe then, push out the other bull or whatever it may be. So it's very tricky, because we have intervened in certain cases, and at the end of the day, it's not really our call to make. It's more the reserves and the reserve managers and the ecologists and the professionals there. They sort of decide how much of a hands-on approach they're willing to take as a reserve. And different reserves just have different sort of ideas around that. So some will be very hands-on, some will be completely hands-off. And then, in terms of endangered, I'd say, things like wild dogs, pangolins, stuff like that. It's tricky. Once again, it's the same sort of thing. Wild dogs, they get into fights the whole time with each other, especially in the mating season. They end up with horrible facial wounds and things like that. They get attacked by, they're always attacking each other, the other predators, between hyena and lion and that sort of thing. So to intervene in that scenario it's probably not right at the end of the day, as endangered as it is. I think only if you're dealing with a really critically endangered population, but then by that point, you're already looking at other options and alternatives of actually managing that population rather than having it free roaming.
To take the rhino, for example, on your Instagram, there's photos, and on the website for African Wildlife Vets, photos of the dehorning process, and it looks really brutal. But why is that kind of drastic measure necessary in the conservation of rhinos?
Yeah, so it looks very brutal. It definitely does. I mean, when you're taking a chainsaw to even a tree, it looks brutal. So to take it to a living animal, it's a little bit difficult for some people to swallow. But pretty much, so what's happened in those recent dehornings is the first time we've attempted it on such a massive scale in what we call the open system. So when I keep saying the open system, it's sort of the areas that are adjacent to the Kruger National Park that do not have a fenced boundary with the Kruger. So they're privately owned areas and run and managed, but they've completely open to the Kruger National Park. So it forms a massive sort of conservation area, but of different managed areas. And dehorning has only really happened in much smaller reserves and it's much smaller populations, because it's easier to manage, and it's a lot more economical and cost effective if you're doing a small population of rhino. Now we're talking about a population of 200, 250 rhino, even more if you consider the populations that didn't dehorn. So what was happening is the two reserves that initially decided, you know what, that's it, we're going to attempt this dehorning, is that they'd run out of all other options. They'd put an immense amount of money into security. They'd put an immense amount of money into anti-poaching, into all sort of facets in an attempt to curb the poaching, which didn't really help. They were still losing an incredible amount of rhino. The two reserves that we'd done on had both lost anywhere between 60 to 100 rhino in the last 6 years. So, it got to a point where they simply had to try something else. And dehorning was something that was happening on smaller properties, and it seemed to be showing positive effects. So they thought, you know what, this is a Hail Mary. Let's give it an attempt and see what happens, because we really don't have anything to lose. And, at the end of the day, security actually is an incredible strain on a budget. It's very expensive. Helicopters and thermal imaging and equipment and salaries and boots on the ground is quite expensive. So the attempt at dehorning wasn't what we'd call a silver bullet. It wasn't going to be the thing that stopped poaching. It wasn't going to be the cure for poaching or the best anti-poaching method out there at all. But it was just something else to add on top of the high security levels and on top of the efforts that were being put in to try and mitigate that. And so the dehorning is pretty much to remove that off a rhino, which it is a target for poachers. So you're taking that horn away. You're trying to break the ratio of the risk rewards, because every time a poacher walks into a protected area, he risks being arrested, he risks losing his life, he risks getting injured out there by another wild animal, whatever it may be, versus the reward, which is getting that horn and eventually selling it on, and it was a much higher reward for what they'd call sort of relatively low risk. So you wanted to bring that down. So the risk stays the same. The risk hasn't changed at all, because the security is still there. Your anti-poaching units are still full force ahead. But now you've brought that reward dramatically down, because now instead of getting 8 kilos of horn or 6 kilos of horn off a massive bull, they're getting, a little bit that's left behind. So now it's like, okay, whoa, maybe we shouldn't actually go into that reserve, because that's just not worth it anymore.
And do you know if they have any of the metrics for the success of programs like that?
So it's obviously still ongoing. We probably coming up now. It's almost, what are we on now? So it's just over a year from when we started the process last year, and they've lost. I couldn't give you the exact numbers now, because it's still ongoing between all the reserves, but it's been a dramatic reduction. I mean, ridiculous. And we're not even talking just in losing animals, just poaching incursions. So tracks. So when we talk about an incursion, we talk about a group of poachers moving into a reserve that's been picked up on the boundary fence or wherever it may be, so they know that there's people that are in the reserve looking for rhino, or just looking to cause trouble. And sort of soon after the dehorning in 2 of the reserves, the incursion rate dropped to 0 for the first sort of, I think it was almost 3 months. It was almost 0 incursions that they had, no incidents. There were a handful of rhino. I want to say it's sort of like 2 or 3 animals that have been lost in a year.
Wow. What impact does it have on the rhino? I understand that it's similar to fingernails, so it may not necessarily hurt, but does it have an impact on sort of like their social structures or anything like that, or how they interact with other rhinos?
So it doesn't appear to be. There's still a lot of ongoing research with that, because obviously that's a question we get a lot from people. But interestingly enough, rhinos are not the greatest mothers, if you could say that, in terms of protecting calves, and that they don't outwardly need their horn for something like that. That's the biggest thing we get. Or they're not going to start getting attacked. They can't protect themselves against predators. Not really. It doesn't seem to. We're not suddenly seeing lions are eating a whole load more rhinos since we started dehorning. It simply just doesn't happen. So the biggest issue is territorial bulls. You just don't want to run in, because we're such an open system and a free flowing of animals. You want to make sure you get all the animals, because you don't want a territorial bull that's got a horn, end up fighting with a bull that doesn't have a horn. That's obviously a semblance of risk over there. We've still had bulls, both dehorned, having proper goes at each other. Whether or not that's going to affect things, whereas they'd have killed each other in the past, because one of them would have ended up being stronger and would end up with those horrific injuries I spoke about. Now that they're both dehorned, can they really do that much damage to each other that actually ends up in one dying or moving out of the territory, or what happens over there? But sort of what the consensus has been is that any negative effects, let's say the predation increased 10%, it's never going to be, and it's just throwing figures out there. But let's say, lions started killing 3-4 more rhino calves a year than they did in general. That negative effect, based on the negative effect of poaching, it's just not even comparable. So we haven't seen any negative effects in the populations that we've dehorned that would suggest that it's a bad idea, considering what we were losing for poaching. Having said that, it's not an extremely long-lived species, but it is quite. So, all these studies, the worst thing is you need time, and you almost need to continue with the procedure, because if we stop dehorning, then you can't really tell what the long-term effects actually are. We need to look 5 years down the line, 10 years down the line, and actually see, is there something? Because immediately we won't really be able to tell.
So you mentioned earlier about the elephants and that there's currently a population boom going on. What's driving that increase in population in the elephants?
Look, most of the increase in populations in most species that we have these days is just increased protection. It's increased protection, the increased availability of resources for them. So, very often they're just living in areas now that are perfect for them. It's perfect for reproductive success, and that's the biggest thing. So it's also space contraction. It's that. So, we're living in a world now where in the protected areas, it's excellent for the species that we're working with, but you're talking about areas that are just more and more contracted by population explosion in people. So our protected areas are getting smaller and smaller. So whereas a huge population of elephants would, just roam absolutely enormous areas, they're just not doing that anymore. There's none of those old migratory routes. There's none of that, moving out of the protected areas and just utilizing huge amounts of space, because it just doesn't exist anymore. So, it's not necessarily a population explosion if you looked at the bigger picture and you took us out of it, but it's a population explosion in terms of the protected areas we have. It's too many elephants for too little land that is available to them.
So what are your impressions then on something like in Botswana? Yeah, they have lots of elephants there now, and they've reopened hunting as conservation, and I guess the other side of it is like these farms that raise rhino and I guess elephant as well for ivory to then be sold as a way to sort of like curtail the need for poaching. What are your thoughts on those sort of practices?
So, I mean, I guess it's twofold. I'll tackle the hunting aspect first. I know it's two very contentious issues you're throwing out there, that's for sure. And sort of this is solely my own opinion. And the trouble with these sort of topics is it's all very opinionated, so you can never really get a victory here. But essentially, I'm very much pro-hunting and what we'd call sort of sustainable utilization per se. So I'm very much pro-hunting, but I've never hunted personally, and I probably never would. I don't see the benefit or the joy out of it, but we're all different on this planet, so what brings joy to somebody else just doesn't do it for me. The effects, though, that I've seen, the positive effects of hunting when it's done correctly. So I'm pro-ethical and sustainable hunting, and there's a lot of non-great hunting practices unfortunately out there, but isn't there that sort of thing with any industry that makes money? It's just that's the way the world goes. You're going to get the good apples and you're going to get the rotten apples inevitably. So for me, the benefit of hunting for conservation when it's done properly it's just immense. You cannot get around it. You're talking in areas as a very easy example. I'll use the South African Reserve as an example that does their hunting sustainably, ethically, and it has to have ecological principles as well. The animals that you're taking out of the system mustn't impact the genetics, for example. So you don't want to be hunting 100-pound elephant genetics like they used to in the past, willy-nilly, and that's why we're sitting with so few 100-pound elephants at the moment. So, something like a lion, for example, will be shot and hunted for R1 million. Okay, now R1 million is a huge income for a reserve, and we're talking one animal. For the amount of animals, what people don't realize in these protected areas, when these sort of lion populations explode, you end up with the space running out. So now these subadult males, for example, they need to go and find themselves a new home because they keep getting pushed out by the big dominant males, or you get big dominant males that are getting pushed out by younger animals. So where do they go? They pushed and they pushed and they pushed and they pushed and they hit a fence. And then they hit a fence, and where do they go? They go outside the fence. And then where do they end up? They end up in the community lands. So what happens there? They get destroyed by the environmental affairs people. And last year alone, there were 14 lions shot as damage causing animals that were in community areas, out of formal protected areas, and were killing cattle and causing trouble out there because there just simply wasn't the space for them. Now, if you took those 14 lions, at the end of the day, they were shot. There's no two ways about it. They were going to get shot. They unfortunately can't be translocated. That's another thing people seem to think is very easy. It's not. Most of these reserves have all very high and strong lion populations, and there's no space to just take lions and go and pop them everywhere else. That model just simply doesn't exist, unfortunately. Once again, with the space contraction, we just don't have the space. So my argument was always, if those 14 lions were going to get shot inevitably, and it's going to happen, it's going to keep happening, as long as we have formal protected areas where lions will thrive because of their protection in there. If you are hunting the right kind of animals out of that population, prime males that are out of their breeding prime, they've been pushed out by younger males, and you get those 14 lions, which would have been 14 million rand to the budget of the reserve, what does that do for the security at the end of the day? Because that's where all the money goes. A reserve generates an income. They need to maintain their fences. They need to maintain the anti-poaching units. They need to maintain their helicopters. They need to pay everybody to do the jobs on the reserves, because it just doesn't exist. People visit a reserve and they're like, oh, it just exists. No, it doesn't. It costs an absolute fortune to run a reserve. So, that's one aspect. It's very often hunting is a income stream for a reserve that forms part of the budget. So the other income stream is obviously photographic tourism. When the people enter the reserve, you pay your entrance fee, let's call it. So we call it the conservation levy. So every tourist that visits a lodge pays a conservation levy, and they go into the reserve, and then that money obviously goes to the reserve. Hunting has always been used as a means to make up the shortfall. And the shortfall is great. People think that you get enough money from photographic tourism. You don't. As a simple example, one of the reserves we work on, they were getting 33% of their budget for the year was coming from photographic tourism. Whereas the other 67%, or actually it was a little bit less because they had donors, and that was coming from hunters. But what people don't realize is that the big difference as well is that the 33% came from 25,000 people visiting the reserve. The 67% came from 42 hunters. So what is the ecological footprint and the carbon footprint and the whole effect on the environment of those incredibly fancy lodges, vehicles driving all over the show, everyone's having a great shower, there's saunas in half the lodges, there's swimming pools, there's the electricity uses, etc. And then you take a hunter who's staying in a tent and they're doing everything on foot. So it's very easy to immediately look at it at face value, and it's like, we can't do that, you're killing an animal, that's brutal, how could you possibly do that? But the reality is that by taking that single animal out of the system, if it's done properly, the effect on the environment is absolutely negligible. On biodiversity, on everything is negligible. The positive kickback from that, from the income from that, is massive. And then you go and look at how many tourists you're going to take to get R1 million to shoot one lion in a reserve. How many tourists you're going to have to get to front that same R1 million? Go and look at what their ecological footprint is going to be overall, on the reserve, what they're going to do in terms of water usage. I mean, it's terrifying in terms of waste production. And that's a big thing, because we should be looking at this once again as biodiversity. It's not simply it's hunting or not hunting. It's not just photographic tourism or not. It's the whole spectrum of things and the whole biodiversity of everything. And it's a lot bigger than just one aspect. And having said that, it's a very simplistic example. It's a topic that is incredibly challenging to ever find a middle ground on, because there are absolutely 100% the people that are hunting wrong, and they're hunting for personal benefit, and they're hunting for personal income in that, and not really benefiting biodiversity and conservation at the end of the day. They're using it they're selling it as that, but they're in fact not doing that. But once again, it's the only way to combat that is to become more of a population. I mean, we've got such access to resources and information. Rather become more of a population that, instead of being I'm massively anti-hunting or I'm massively pro-hunting, and those two freaking people just going crazy at each other and nothing gets done, is try and, from both sides, do a little bit of research and find the middle ground, and focus rather more on, if it is going to happen, it needs to be sustainable and ethical, done properly. If it's not going to happen, then there has to be an alternative source of income. So both sides have to come to the party. You can't just freaking sit on both sides, like on both ends, because then we're getting nowhere at the end of the day.
Yeah, you're definitely reiterating something that we've heard a lot from various experts that we've spoken to over the last couple of weeks, is that these issues are never purely biological, they're never purely environmental. There's always this human element to them, which complicates matters, and you have social and economic issues wrapped up in all of these concerns about conservation and environmental protection and stuff. And I think, yeah, people do really try and like simplify things down in their own minds, but yeah, they're always a lot more complex than they appear on the surface. What are some of the biggest success stories that you've seen? Obviously, the elephant populations and the rhinos we've mentioned. Are there any other kind of success stories in conservation that you've seen?
Look, there's loads. I mean, we've been very fortunate to work with a lot of incredible organizations and people, working very hard to save a multitude of different species. So, there's been huge breakthroughs in things, for example, like the wild dog meta population, where, they've, and range expansion projects for both cheetah and wild dog, which we've been quite heavily involved in. And, they've done incredibly well to increase a number of an endangered species to an extent where they're really, really healthy in South Africa at the moment, where we're actually running out of space once again, and starting to look at countries, neighboring countries and countries further abroad that are willing to potentially take wild dogs as reintroductions. And they've already successfully taken 2 packs to Mozambique, to 2 different reserves that side. So, that's been a great success.
What was the threat that the dogs were facing?
So it's, generally speaking, a lot of the time it's anthropogenic once again. They're very heavily persecuted because they have massive ranges. So they're very often running out of formal protected areas, ending in game farms where guys have valuable game species, or they end up in livestock areas or community areas or areas where they're just simply not welcome. They get poisoned, they get shot, they get hit by cars when they're crossing the roads, because they just range massive areas, and they don't really have much respect for a fence. They go in and under and out as much as they please. And then also just high predator, sort of competitive predator populations. So a lot of the small reserves are quite small. And now you've got a really healthy lion population, and they compete very heavily with wild dogs, things like spotted hyena as well. So they end up getting killed by competitive predators as well. Disease was a big thing. There were a couple big rabies and canine distemper outbreaks in certain populations. So they had a big vaccination drive in the Kruger National Park and in some of the parks in one of our other provinces. When they actually darted a whole lot of them with rabies vaccination and canine distemper vaccines, and it seemed to be quite effective as well. So disease had a very big effect.
What were the things that you've done that sort of mitigated the anthropogenic issues with the wild dog? What sort of why did you see such success?
So, I mean, I can't take any credit for that. I mean, from a veterinary perspective, we are very often only involved in the end product, which is actually, either the immobilization and translocation at the end of the day, moving them between reserves or darting for the collarings or snare removals, whatever it may be. The different entities that have been involved in wild dog sort of, can't really say rehabilitation, but in the numbers increase and the work on the wild dogs, they've worked a lot on just creating awareness and knowledge and informing people, because wild dogs is a species that just nobody knows anything about, so to generate funding and support for a species like wild dogs is very, very difficult, because you ask people what's a wild dog and they just have no clue. They reckon it's a normal domestic dog that's escaped out of your home and it's now running in the bush, so it's very difficult with species like that. So they've done a lot for sort of putting them on the map per se, and then also informing farmers and going to those places and trying to mitigate conflict by simply being there, being a face, being someone that's taking responsibility, because a lot of people don't, they just go forward. There's no one to assist. When they call the environmental affairs guys, nobody comes out. So they've just been a presence, when there's been a problem, They can phone these guys because they know they help with wild dogs. It's as simple as that. But then they also will be like, they'll phone you and they'll say, "You're wild dogs." And it's like, no, hang on. We don't own the wild dogs in the country. They're not our dogs just because we support wild dogs, you know. But so it's simply about being a presence and going across and helping out by doing a lot of the satellite tracking collar studies. It's helped a lot in picking up when there's been animals with snares, being able to go and find that pack and actually, you know, get a dart in and take that snare off when they're running out of formal protected areas, to actually be able to locate them and either bring them back or go and mitigate the issue and see how you can manage it and see if the farmers are willing to just wait for them to pass through. So satellite tracking collars have made a huge difference in being able to mitigate those issues, because to try and find a wild dog otherwise, I mean, someone will tell you it's there, they're here, we're sitting here looking at them, and then you drive, and in an hour's time that thing's 20 kilometers away and you're not going to see it again. So putting tracking collars on has been a very effective means at helping mitigate certain scenarios.
I think they're amazing, the wild dogs. It's always my favorite sequence on Our Planet or Planet Earth. Like, the dog sequences are always incredible.
Yeah, I think that's done a massive thing for them. I mean, for wild dogs, as soon as you got something with David Attenborough talking about them, like on Dynasties, it automatically puts them on the map. Everyone's like, "Wow, this is pretty cool," you know, because otherwise there's not a lot of footage, and now it's come out a lot more, which is fantastic. I mean, it's going to make a big difference for their conservation at the end of the day, and the amount of funding essentially that goes in that direction.
What's your favorite animal?
Tricky. I really enjoy, from a work perspective, I really enjoy working with wild dogs, just because of the whole conservation thing around them. You know, it's not as simple as just darting and doing something. Very often there's a bigger story to it all, which I really enjoy. But if I'm just driving around and I'm looking for something, I'm a massive fan of a leopard, for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So on my last day in Kruger, I saw a leopard in the tree, and like I think I was there for 4 days. The whole time I was dying to see a leopard. Very last day, last minute, we're driving towards the exit. Loads of cars parked. Everyone's looking up at this tree.
Standard. That's how it always goes.
But then within 30 seconds, it got tired of all the people looking at it, so it just bounced into the forest, bounced into the bush.
That's brilliant.
So where does conservation go from here in South Africa? What's the future of it? What does it look like?
It's a tricky one. Following on from COVID, I really don't know. You know, I think there's going to be a lot of funding that's just simply not going to go into wildlife anymore, and it's going to go more into public health and things like that. So it might be very challenging for certain projects to continue and still generate and get funding in towards wildlife. You know, with the tourism sector so down as well, we'll have to see what's going to happen there. But if COVID hadn't happened, it's really, I think there's an interesting scenario playing out between South Africa or Southern Africa and the rest of Africa, because we unfortunately, not even unfortunately, it's got its pros and cons, but South Africa is a very small country in terms of its protected areas and the space between those protected areas and our population. So we have a lot of formal protected areas, but they're all these very isolated, small fenced areas all around the country. So everything, once you fenced it off, is very intensively managed. And that's worked really well for us as a country. I mean, most of our wildlife populations are increasing. If you look at an IUCN Red list, or you look at a list of wildlife species that are in decline, 9 out of 10 times they're actually on the increase in South Africa. So it's been a very effective means for population management, for species doing really well. But there's the argument from the eastern and northern sort of, or not so much West Africa's conservation sort of game is coming up a bit more now, but the East African sort of contingency, Kenya, Tanzania, that side of the world, massive expansive areas, the Serengeti and the Mara and all of that, you know, no fences, completely open systems, and they rave about their wildness, and they have very negative perceptions of what happens in Southern Africa because we fence things, because we manage them. You know, they automatically think that a lot of the methods that we're using are questionable, for example. because they don't do that there. It's hands off. It's like, well, how can you guys do that down there? And it's like, well, look, it's worked for us because that's what we've had to do here to maintain our protected areas.
Because of the population density.
Yeah, I mean, we'd love to have expansive areas, that would be amazing. But the reality is that in a lot of those African countries as well, their areas are contracting. I mean, they're seeing the same pressures. They're seeing the same people pressures. They're seeing the same issues. And, everyone hates a fence, and as much as possible, they should be avoided. But they can be very effective in the right circumstances in terms of protection. The only other thing where people could probably learn from South Africa's history is that when we put up the fences, it was very much exclusionary. So it was like, this fence is going up because you people must be there and the wildlife must be here. And in a country that was racked by things like apartheid and segregation, that was just another thing. It was the wealthy and the elitists that got to go to these protected areas, and the poorer communities on the other side of the fences were once again just segregated and fenced off. So that's somewhere where I think a lot of countries could learn from us, is if they ever went that route, it's got to be inclusionary. The local people, the livelihoods of the people that are there, where in the areas that you're trying to protect, they have to benefit and they can't be excluded by a fence. The fence must be there, if it needs to go up. It can't be there in that sort of sense.
Nice.
Yeah. But otherwise, I don't know where it's going to be going forward. We're doing pretty well in the projects that we're working. We're very fortunate to have a lot of amazing people in the country working in conservation. A lot of entities and organizations, a high concentration of guys that are doing amazing research. So there's a lot of stuff coming out of here that's really positive, and I think it's just important to try and get the flow of information within the conservation body across the continent, and information sharing is quite important, because some guys, it's the egos are just too big and the pride is just too much, and they're just not interested in listening to each other, So I think that's a big thing. Less infighting and more sort of everyone's going in the same direction. I don't know why it keeps up ending like that.
So is it a positive trend, do you think? Do you feel like there's lots more attention on these issues than there used to be in an effort to raise awareness and also to put the funds in through NGOs and stuff? Have you seen an increase?
Yeah, I'd say I think so. The problem for me, or not the problem, it's not really a problem. It's just that I'm very young in my career, so I haven't been around long enough in the conservation game to know if things have changed dramatically. You'd have to talk to someone that's been in it for 20, 30 years, and they could tell you, yeah, there's definitely a trend. From chatting to these guys, it really seems like it. There's been a lot of positive change. There's been a lot of 3 steps forward, 2 steps backwards, but we're still going forward. But that's inevitable whenever we're dealing with something like this. So I'd like to believe, I'm always positive, so I'd like to believe it is positive. I don't see any massive, issues. There's always going to be, conservation is always going to be fraught with difficulties, and trying to manage people and wildlife populations. Unfortunately, as long as we begin or continue to just breed, I guess, there's just not enough space for wildlife and people at the rate that we're going, and it'll be a sad day when we start impacting on conservation areas even more, because it's huge. It's already, and it's just human population driven. There's just no space for wildlife, and we're trying to make more space for us. And I think the only way forward there, and I think it's a lot of the big, the guys, they've come up with these, it's the conservation, the signatories to the conservation of biology or conservation of biodiversity. I've forgotten the name of the sort of entity and the countries that are signatories of this whole conservation of biodiversity plan. But that's a big thing, it's all that sort of stuff is positive, and it's just going to be slow. That's inevitable. Like, there's not a chance that wildlife conservation or any sort of conservation or this sort of thing is going to happen in 10, 20 years. It's just going to be a slow process, and hopefully just constantly improving.
Yeah, and then I guess on the African continent too, that's the human population growth is so high too, and then yet you're also a continent with some of the most diverse wildlife in the world, and probably I would assume one of the highest numbers of endangered and threatened species. So those are some sort of competing factors there.
No, absolutely, and not only is it some of the biggest populations, it's some of the poorest populations, unfortunately, and people are living in absolute poverty, and that's where it becomes really tricky trying to balance that sort of thing out. Because at the end of the day, conservation is a privilege. We all sit in a privileged position to talk about, don't go and walk into that reserve and kill that rhino. But at the end of the day, I've got food, I've got a home, I've got a safe and healthy family, and I've got access to protection services and healthcare and whatever I may need, and education. If you're striving every day just to figure out how you're going to put food on the table, how do you sit there at the end of that day and get told like, oh no, but also, you guys need to be careful about those rhino. You need to make sure you keep them safe because, that's good for tourism and that's good for the economy. It just doesn't work like that. You can't talk to someone who's trying to just figure out how to survive about conservation. But that's a completely privileged topic. And that's why there's got to be some benefit, not some, there's, a lot of the benefits got to go that route. Has got to come from the wild areas to the people who are living around it in a way that improves their livelihoods. Otherwise, you look at a place like Kruger National Park, you have 2 million people living on the boundary, like on the boundary. It's like a hard boundary. There's the fence and the population starts and the human pressure starts. So if you're struggling for food and you look over the fence there and there's wildlife running around, or someone comes along and tells you they're going to pay you 50,000 Rand if you go and get a rhino horn, why wouldn't you? And that's the worst thing with the world as well. It's like, kill the poachers, blow them up, these monsters, it's like, no, guys, it's not how it works. The monsters are the kingpins that are sitting across in the east, 100%. But the guy that's trying to feed his family, sure, it's not cut and dried. It's not everybody. But, the guy that's trying to feed his family or just find a bit of an income or something like that, it's the way of society.
That was really great. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was really nice.
Man, you're welcome. Great
Take care.
Awesome. Cool. Go well, guys. Cheers.